A Woman's Best Friend by Tara. My husband lost his job and we ended up moving to a mobile home his parents own in the South California desert where he grew up. After living my entire life in the liberal enclaves of the PNW North Cali mountains and forests, an unexpected and unwanted move to a red zone where I knew literally no one besides my in-laws, who don't particularly like me, was highly stressful to say the least. Add to this situation that our 6-year-old was experiencing major culture shock and homesickness. I was about 4 months pregnant and my husband was being a major taint crumb. Just to give you an idea of the level of stress in the house. Oh, and did I mention we moved to in the middle of July where temperatures were hovering around 120 degrees Fahrenheit and my father-in-law neglected to tell us that the AC in the house was broken and that there was no flooring in half the place? Yeah, walking nightmare. After about a month of us three living in my father-in-law's tiny study, the house is finally livable. It's located in the fringes of a tiny town that is about 45 minutes from the closest city. We have a truck stop gas station, a fire station, a corner store, and a smattering of houses. Our street dead ends at and is surrounded by BLM land and is tucked in between low hills, backups to mountains. Half of the other houses are uninhabited. My husband found work near his parents' house in the city, and since his parents were willing to help with childcare, our kiddos started going to school there as well. This left me at home alone, with no car for long hours, which I secretly loved because it gave me time to unpack emotionally and physically, and also meant I had limited interaction with my in-laws, so I could enjoy being radically pregnant without jabs about how fat my face was getting. One day, about 3 weeks after we moved into the house, something felt off. I was sitting down in the living room, which has no windows to the front yard, and suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that I just had to let my dog go in now. Even though she's only been outside for a few minutes, as I walked into the kitchen, I realized that it was eerily silent and still outside. Keep in mind, it was late August in the desert, so the windows and doors were all closed and the AC was on. So I'm not sure how I knew it was creepy outside before I opened the door to call my dog in, but somehow I did. Usually there's a breeze or bugs buzzing or hummingbirds hitting up to the feeder on our deck, which had been the case when I let the dogs out. But when I opened up the sliding door to call for my dog, there was absolute silence. And when I looked out into the yard, I realized why. Sitting at our gate was a gigantic black dog, and I don't just mean a big dog. The top of this dog's head was just below the top edge of our 8-foot chain link gate. It was easily as wide as a Mini Cooper, and it looked like a cross between a Newfoundland and a grizzly bear. My dog is a Shar-Pei pit bull mix, and she only came to about mid-chest on this huge beast. She's sitting there, maybe 10 feet from it, with just a flimsy chain fence between them, watching it quietly. Tears immediately started pouring down my cheeks. I don't cry easily, and suddenly it felt like I was carrying 2 full-sized adults over my shoulders. It took every ounce of energy I had to walk to the edge of our small deck. I tried to very quietly whistle for my dog, and nothing really came out, or if it did, it was swallowed by the silence. Right there, just as I whistled, both my dog and the black dog turned their heads to look at me. My dog slowly stood up and calmly walked over to me. You have to understand, she is the derpest, bounciest collection of happy squish-face love and never does anything less than bound across the yard with her tail up, tongue out, ears perked when she's called, so this was completely out of character. When she reached me, she turned and looked back at the black dog, then back at me, then started to walk back towards it, like she wanted me to follow her. I made a lunge for her and grabbed her harness. The dog stood up and we locked eyes. I was then hit by the deepest sadness I ever felt, worse than when either of my parents died. It was like a cold wave crashed directly in the center of my heart. I was sobbing uncontrollably as I dragged my dog inside. And when I looked back, the black dog had begun to walk down the street towards the mountains. It went behind a large Palo Verde shrub and disappeared. I sat on my kitchen floor sobbing and shivering for a good hour despite the searing summer temps. I finally calmed down and worked up the nerve to take my dog out again later that afternoon. When I checked the area around the gate for paw prints, there were none. but there was a huge void in the sandy tire tracks my husband made when he left for work. My dog remained subdued for a while, but was back to herself by the time my husband and kids got home. I didn't say anything to him. Things weren't really great between us, and he was in a bad mood. He noted later on how funny it was that our dog kept pacing back and forth in front of the gate. About a week later, I went in for a prenatal appointment. I'd lost my baby. The doctor said it was a failure to thrive. Nothing I could have done. Sometimes these things happen, situations. I'd been feeling off for about 2 weeks, but had just chalked it up to how stressful life had been. I honestly would have marked the black dog off as a stress-induced hallucination or something had my dog not interacted with it so intensively. About a month later, I was hiking on the south end of the Joshua Tree with my husband. We turned around to follow a hawk that had flown overhead, and there on the trail we just walked was a big black dog. Not as big as the one at the house. This one was closer to the size of a normal Newfoundland. It just sat down and, as funny as it sounds, sneezed, then got up and walked off. My husband tried to follow it, but lost it. The area we were hiking was all low plants. Nowhere for this dog to have come from or gone without us seeing it for quite a while. Before it appeared, we had been talking about our baby, and had actually settled on a name for him, even though we never met him. I guess you could say the black dog is something malicious or to blame for losing the pregnancy, but I don't. I think it came to escort the little soul I had onto its proper place in the universe. It gives me great comfort to think of a little boy resting in the guard of a big fluffy dog. My husband still thinks the one we saw while hiking was a stray, but whenever my dog meets someone new, she sneezes as sort of a I'm friendly gesture. I think the dog was letting me know that the little guy made it to where he needed to be safely. Siblings and Scissors by, yes, Butthole Jerky. About 7 years ago, my boyfriend and I moved into a duplex. After living there for about 6 months, we had become well acquainted with our neighbors. Everyone was cool except for this older lady and her creepy brother who claimed to be a medicine man. He also liked to stare into everyone's windows, especially at women. One night at about 2 in the morning, the older lady comes pounding on our door. She says that her grandson had stolen her car and taken it to town. She needed to look for him. She didn't want to call the police on him. Unfortunately, times were tough and we only had enough gas to get to and from work, let alone drive aimlessly looking for her grandson's car. We told her we were sorry and we were unable to help. She got mad at us and stormed off, muttering to herself. We went to bed and didn't think anything of it until a week later. We had went to town for a few groceries one day. When we came home, we discovered things were amiss. Knickknacks had been moved around, our wire plant shelf had been moved away from the wall, and the back of it faced our front door. We initially thought someone had broke into our apartment, but couldn't find anything missing. The door wasn't open or unlocked when we got home. No windows were broken or had been opened. We thought someone was just fucking with us. Later in the evening, we went to cook dinner and discovered all of our cooking knives were missing. Upon searching our apartment for the second time, we also discovered our pocket knives, scissors, and box cutter were gone. Starting to feel officially creeped the fuck out at this point, I walked into my bedroom to see if there was anything else out of place. Then I noticed my needle tool, which is for making pottery, was stuck in the wall, all the way down to the handle. It was perfectly positioned at the head of our bed, about 3 feet up from our pillows. I turned my room upside down on a hunch. I lifted our mattress, and lo and behold, our kitchen knives, pocket knives, scissors, and box cutters were all laying on the top of the box spring. The pocket knives were open, the box cutter blades were protruding, and the scissors in, well, scissor position. It was some freaky demon shit. There's no way anyone had entered our house unless they had a key, which also is highly unlikely. We smudged, blessed our apartment, and prayed over it because we could just feel negative energy and spent a sleepless night being creeped out. The next morning we went outside to smoke an anxiety cigarette. Lo and behold, our creepy pervert neighbor was on his porch, grinning at us the entire time we were out there. Imagine a psychotic Gomez Adams grin, if you will. I know it sounds crazy, but we were pretty sure it had something to do with denying his sister a ride. I'm not sure what they did, but it was supernatural and it scared the actual shit out of me. Natalie's Dad by Lilac Wine. This is a little more creepy and disturbing than scary, but it's something that still gives me chills when I think about it, and I try not to think about it very often. Note, all names have been changed. From about 5th to 9th grade, my best friend Natalie and I were pretty much inseparable. We lived only a few streets away from each other in an idyllic little town in the Midwest. The kind of place that feels like living in a time capsule of the 1950s. Charming houses with beautifully kept gardens, huge old maple and oak trees lining every street, neighbors who actually stop and greet each other as they walk their dogs and mow their lawns. Summer block parties, kids playing in the streets until dinner time, that sort of thing. Natalie and I used to walk to and from school together every day, and I often stayed over at her house for an hour or two after school while my parents were still at work. I loved hanging out at her place because her mom was the sweetest person ever. She'd serve us delicious snacks. We'd tell her all about the latest middle school drama, and she'd even let us watch a TV show or play a computer game before we started our homework. Natalie's dad worked a lot and wasn't around often, but whenever I did interact with him, something about him seemed off. On a superficial level, he was perfectly nice and friendly, even funny. He had a great sense of humor and was always joking with Natalie and me and the rest of our friends on the occasions that he was around. But even though I didn't sense a single bit of discomfort from any of my close friends, I couldn't help but feel uneasy in his presence. For one thing, he was a bit too touchy-feely. It was subtle, but I was always noticing it in little ways that made me slightly uncomfortable. Quick example. One weekend, he took me, Natalie, and two of our friends to a cedar mill. We picked apples, drank cider, and went on hay rides. When the ride was over, Natalie's dad was helping each of us off the wagon. I was the last in line. Something about the way he grabbed my friends by the waist and let his hand linger just a touch too long once they were safely on the ground started to weird me out. When it was my turn, I quickly jumped off the wagon before he could touch me. He looked a little bewildered, but didn't say anything. Fast forward to Natalie's 12th birthday. She had a sleepover with about 10 girls, and we arranged our sleeping bags on the floor of her living room since it was the biggest room in the house. The living room wasn't really closed off by any doors. It had a big opening that connected it seamlessly to the foyer front hallway of the house. I was sleeping near the hallway, which I wasn't pleased about as I preferred to sleep surrounded by people wherever I went to have sleepovers. I've always been super afraid of the dark and liked having that protection, as silly as it sounds. In the middle of the night, I'm awoken by a hand pressing on my arm. I didn't jolt awake or anything, but I opened my eyes and turned my head to survey my fellow partygoers. They were all dead asleep, some even lightly snoring. And suddenly, I heard quiet giggling behind me. Still laying down and now officially frightened, I quickly turned my body to face the foyer. The opening in that wall connected the living room and foyer was a big, sweeping arch. On the right side of the arch, I could just barely see the top of a man's head peeking out from behind the wall. Only about 3 feet from the ground. Then I noticed his fingertips splayed out on the wooden floor. He was crouching. It was Natalie's dad. I froze. I honestly had no idea what to do. Was he just kidding around? Didn't it occur to him how creepy this was? Do I say something or just awkwardly ignore it and fall back asleep? Being my timid, non-confrontational preteen self, I decided to go the latter route. I turned back on my other side, scooted in as close as I could to my friend sleeping next to me, and somehow managed to fall back asleep, despite being obviously, understandably petrified. I'm not sure how long it was before I was woken up again, this time by a firm tapping on my temple. Knowing who it was this time around, I tried my best not to indicate that I was awake. Struggling to keep my eyes closed and breathing slow and deep, again, I heard that same stiff giggling. The sound was particularly disturbing because it was almost manic, like he thought the whole routine was absurdly hilarious and could barely contain himself. Even though it was coming from a grown man, It had the giddiness of a 5-year-old playing hide-and-go-seek with his older siblings. Yet again, I had no idea what to do. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to acknowledge him or what. I turned to face the foyer again and just barely caught a glimpse of his head and fingers disappearing behind the wall of the same crouched position. More giggling. I quickly turned back and scooted even closer into my sleeping friend, partially waking her and causing her to shift around a bit. I hoped she would wake up completely, but she just turned over and quickly drifted back off. As I pulled my sleeping bag tighter over my shoulders, I heard what sounded like someone shuffling on all fours down the hallway. I don't remember how I got back to sleep that night, but somehow I did, and morning finally, mercifully, arrived. Natalie's parents made us all pancakes, and her dad was acting completely normal. He didn't pay any particular attention to me, but didn't make a point to ignore me either. Just interacted with me like he did with everyone else, always smiling and joking and friendly. A couple months later, Natalie had another sleepover. This time I made sure to secure a sleeping spot in the exact center of everyone, far from the front hallway. But later that night, I was abruptly woke up in the middle of a deep sleep for surprisingly no reason. I had been sleeping on my back and just suddenly opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, wide awake. Almost instantly, I was overcome with the most intense feeling of dread that I've ever experienced. I felt like I couldn't move my limbs, like some invisible weighted blanket was holding my body down. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I slowly turned my head towards the front hallway. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see Natalie's mom and dad standing in the entryway looking directly at me with the most angry, hateful expressions on their faces. They were positioned awkwardly far from each other, about 2 feet of space between them, with their arms stiff and straight at their sides. Even though they were a fair distance away from me, I'll never forget how disturbing their faces looked, contorted into pure rage that only seemed to grow in intensity the longer I allowed myself to look. Their eyes kept narrowing, and they were showing all their teeth, the way a threatened dog would, gritting them so tightly I thought their jaws would crack. After staring, frozen, for a good few seconds, I finally felt like I could move my arms and legs again. I quickly turned away from them and pulled my sleeping bag high over my head, shaking. I barely slept the rest of the night, but I never heard any noises or movement from the hallway. The next morning, it was, again, all homemade pancakes and warm smiles and utter normalcy yet again. I never told Natalie about any of this, but I was pretty sure she would think I was either crazy or trying to prank her. Our friendship quickly faded a few years later anyway, which coincidentally was right around the time her parents got divorced. Recently, Natalie and her parents' divorce came up in a conversation with my mom, who told me a comment about Natalie's mom made to her a few years ago, back when Natalie and I were still super close. We had actually taken a few small road trip vacations together with our moms. I guess at some point on one of those trips, our moms were gossiping about a particularly wealthy and impossible perfect family that lived in our neighborhood and had a reputation of being somewhat pretentious. Natalie's mom, skeptical about their apparent perfection, said, "Well, in this neighborhood, you never know what goes on behind closed doors." The comment is innocent enough, but for me, it adds an extra layer of creepiness given what I experienced with Natalie's parents. Camera Obscura by Dirt in the Skirt. Bachika bow wow. Tried posting this one a few years ago, but was too late. Not a ghost story, but one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. It happened during my freshman year of college, when I was back in my hometown for Thanksgiving break. I'm from a small town in New England, the kind of place you can't wait to get away from because nothing ever happens there. I guess maybe this was my town's way of getting back at me for thinking that. It was late on a Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I was at a friend's house, happily reunited with my best friends from high school, since we were all home for the holiday. A fog set in that night, owing to the classic New England mix of chill and humidity. As I drove home, I went by our town's library, which is situated next to a small duck pond. The fog was extra thick over the water and illuminated by the lampposts surrounding the pond. It gave it an eerie, golden glow being the film student that I was, I had my camera with me as always. Without thinking, I turned my car around, pulled into the library parking lot which overlooked the pond. I considered walking down to the pond for a moment, but something told me not to do that. It wasn't fear, not yet. I remember not feeling any fear at all, just excitement and awe of the sight in front of me. But still, I didn't get out of my car, and that decision probably saved my life. Instead, I kept my car running, headlights still on, rolled down my window, stuck my arm out of the window, and took a few pictures of the pond in the fog. I pulled my arm back inside and looked over the photos. They were pretty terrible, given how bad of a technique I was using. This was the first time something felt wrong. As I looked at the photos, I just felt... The best way I can explain it is that sometimes I have nightmares about being in open water. I know that there are sharks swimming beneath me and I can't see them, but I know they're there. I realized I was having the same feeling in the waking life. As I looked through the pictures, I felt the danger before I saw it. I looked up from my camera, fully alert, and peered in front of me, but I saw nothing for a moment. Then a figure materialized out of the darkness around the pond and into the beams of my headlights. It was a man. He was wearing a dark jeans and a black zip-up fleece jacket. His hair was dark and short. I don't remember his face. He was walking in the direction of the library, in the direction of my car. I waited, not wanting to let my fear take over. Maybe he wasn't walking towards me? Maybe he was going to the road. But he kept coming towards me, walking faster and getting closer. I remembered my window was down and quickly rolled it up. Then he was right in front of the hood of my car. I could tell beyond a shadow of a doubt he was staring straight at me, the look in his eyes. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were intent, determined. The moment we made eye contact, the moment I saw that look, I just reacted. I don't remember feeling fear or panic, just being more alert than I have ever been. I never took my eyes off of the man as I threw my car into reverse and spun out of the parking lot I was in. But I went the wrong way. Instead of turning my car towards the exit, I turned towards the back parking lot. Yes, there was another exit I could get to, but I would have to drive around the entire library to get there. Either that or reverse all the way out to the road and risk hitting something, a tree, another car. I didn't want to risk crashing, then I'd have no escape. I decided I would have to go around the library. It would take longer, but it was the safest option. All these thoughts went through my head in an instant. The man ran to get in front of my car. One of my biggest regrets in life is not running him over then and there, but I didn't. I put my car in drive and waited. He stopped running once he was in front of the car, and then took his time. He walked slowly around the hood of my car, staring at me the whole time. Our eyes followed each other. He smiled. The moment he was clear in front of my car, two things happened. He lunged for my car door, and then I floored it. I remember the sight of my car sailing past his outreached hands. I drove as fast as I had ever driven, taking the corners at speeds around the library. As I came out the other side, the exit was in sight, but the man wasn't. I drove as fast as I could towards the exit. As I got in front of the library again, I looked over. I saw the man running as fast as he could to get to my car. I sped out of the library parking lot and onto the main road. The police station was a block away, and I made a beeline for it, still driving recklessly fast, hoping to be pulled over by a cop. I got to the police station, and that's where the fear finally settled in. I sat in my car and cried, breathing raggedly, completely frozen. I couldn't get out of my car. I was terrified that the man had followed me there, that as soon as I got out, he would get me. A police officer came out to my car and escorted me inside. They must have seen me on the security cameras. I spoke with a female sergeant. I told her what had happened, gave her the best description I could. They immediately sent cars out, but found no one. I assumed that the man was after my car, my camera maybe, and said that aloud. The female sergeant looked at me and shook her head. What she told me, I'll never forget. I don't think he was after your car or your camera. He was after you.